And now I'll pass you on and welcome to our guest speaker tonight, Jonathan Fisher.
Hi, Rob. Well, thank you very much, Rob, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, at the moment I'm freelance and currently working on impacts of sea level rise and storm surges in St. Lucia. Um, I'll see if it can get this to work. Nope. Yep, fine. Um, sorry, just bear with me a minute. Right. What I'm going to do is talk about a report that I've written with European water economists, and there's a report on country experiences which covers England, Lithuania, Netherlands, Romania, Spain, and the European Commission, and then a paper that pulls it all together in terms of analysis and recommendations for reform. It was done by a group of about 8 of us, all from those countries there, plus Pierre Strosser, who was the European Commission's economist responsible for the Water Framework Directive and the Waterco guidance, which I'll tell you more about, and also Eddie Antwies from Greece and Germany, and Manuel Lago from Germany. Just a standard disclaimer that these are the views of the personal views of the authors. They don't necessarily represent the reviews of anybody they've currently worked for or have worked for. And the same applies to me. And also, it doesn't necessarily represent fully the groups of all the group. It's my own personal view. And for this presentation today in the UK, I've focused on reforms of water policy currently being proposed for England and Wales. So at the moment, we've had over the last year what is now 11 reform consultations. This is the same list, well, extended list actually that I gave at the last webinar, Rob, on chalk streams. In brackets is my assessment of each of those consultations or studies out of 10. Those scores have changed slightly. When I last spoke to you, I was very enthusiastic about the Cunliffe's interim report and gave it 8. It's now gone down to +5 and -8. It still has some good points, which is the +5, but it has some major flaws, and I'll highlight those as we go through. And I've also included the DEFRA reform of flood risk management, which is also gets a poor score, to my mind anyway. Now, what I will do is focus on Cunliffe's recommendations and the reforms that they mean. And I'll also bring in the European Commission's resilience water resilience strategy, which, while it doesn't have any jurisdiction here, has a number of points that are highly relevant to UK. So I'll now return to the last item, which is our European Water Economist report. The score in brackets is actually the score that was given by the chair of a webinar I gave for the Foundation for Water Research, and Rob and the commenter and all on the call today can give me their own view, and we can amend that accordingly. What I'll try and give you is pointers for UK water reform. What I'm going to do is say why we wrote the report. Then I'm going to give you some water policy historical background to the Water Framework Directive. I'm then going to go through outline very briefly the Water Framework Directive's economic provisions. And we did, for this report, a SWOT analysis of the Water Framework Directive's economic provisions and their implementation. And I'll go through that. And then I'll finish with recommendations for water reform, which I'll link to the findings of the Cunliffe Commission and also the EC's water resilience strategy. At the FWR webinar, there was some interesting and important issues that were raised during the discussion, and I'll try and cover those as we go through. So why did we write this report? Well, back in 2023, there was a European socioeconomics workshop called Refreshing Water Policy. And us old hands realized at that meeting that we needed to inform new policymakers, practitioners, and researchers of the historical background and the whys and wherefores of the Water Framework Directive, and in particular the Waterco guidance, which I'll explain a bit more in the detail about the economic appraisal guide, economic analysis guidance for the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. Now, the Water Framework Directive, the official Water Framework Directive has an annex on economic analysis, which is very thin. It's 3 paragraphs, which are pretty useless. So we, the Commission and Pierre Strasser led the Waterco guidance, which developed very in-depth guidance on how to do the economic analysis for implementing the Water Framework Directive. Now we also writing the report now because 2027 is 25 years after the start of the Water Framework Directive. So 25 years on, where are we now? What have we learned? And 2027 was the original good ecological status guideline of the Water Framework Directive. Now, there's been some misguided responses to that 2027 deadline. Some people say ditch the Water Framework Directive, including some people high up, which is very misguided to my mind. Others, including the NGOs, treat the 2027 guidance target as binding, which actually would render irrelevant the economic provisions, which I'll go through later, regarding disproportionate costs and delayed target implementation. And to our mind, we need to treat that GES target as an aim to achieve target over further river basin management plan cycles. Now, one reason for that is that in 2000, when we developed the Water Framework Directive, 2027 looked a long way away, and 3 phases of 6-year cycles looked to be about right to achieve the targets over 3 cycles. But in 2005, 2006, in the agency and DEFRA, we did a strategic assessment of implementing the Water Framework Directive. Now, that showed that there would be very high costs of achieving the existing directives, mainly the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, that the Water Framework Directive supersedes but does not replace. So effectively, in the first round, our efforts in England and Wales were essentially just mainly, or for almost all, concerned with implementing the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. And the actual Water Framework Directive measures were not really started until the second River Basin Plan, when they did it properly. Then in 2015, we had, as I said at my last webinar, we had the Liz Truss cuts to the agency, which cut, as a result, the agency cut to 1/3 its river basin management teams, and they were unable to deliver properly River Basin Management Plan 3 and implement the Water Framework Directive properly. And Cunliffe rightly highlights that. And in looking across Europe, there's similar problems in other countries that suffer from resource constraints, and even more so in the Eastern European countries. So what we're going to do is then look for lessons from our 25 years of experience of implementing the Water Framework Directive in various guises, in various countries, in various ways. The various participants in the group have a diverse body of experience. And I'm aiming now to input that into discussions about reform of water policy. So, some water policy historical background. And this fits with the Water Conservators' corporate historical memory, as Martin Bigg highlighted usefully earlier in an earlier exchange. So I'm going to go back to the 1970s and the 1980s, which actually was when I embarked on an environmental economics career for reasons I outlined in my earlier webinar. So back in the 1970s and 80s, there was this heated debate in Europe on the European water policy and approaches between the uniform emission standards on the continent and the UK's environmental quality objectives. Now, in the 1980s, the UK had a bad reputation as the dirty man of Europe, and the continental uniform emission standards held sway. And that resulted in the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which is a prime example of uniform emission standards. It sets uniform standards for discharges from different sizes of sewage treatment plants, regardless of location. Now, economies of scale meant that for the sewage treatment pollution control measures meant that water companies moved in the UK to large works at the bottom of the catchment. And Thames Water did that. And that led to low flow problems at the top of the catchment, especially in Hertfordshire, my county, and also Hertfordshire Sharkies, in the 1990s, and severe problems for chalk streams there. So UK experts from DEFRA, Environment Agency, and SEPA developed the EU Water Framework Directive in 2000 to supersede prescriptive and siloed Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. That aims to achieve good ecological status and through river basin management plans, and hence effectively is embodying the environmental quality objectives approach. It also addressed both the water quality and water resource matters at catchment level, and was called the English Directive by our friends on the continent. So the Water Framework Directive's economic provisions, it was the first directive, EU directive, to expressly incorporate economics. And it did it in three ways. One is it promoted economic instruments to help achieve water objectives in terms of water pricing, and in terms of Article 9 required reporting on the recovery of financial, environmental, and resource costs of water use and services, effectively getting countries to set out the extent of their subsidies and account for them and reduce them. And then in Article 4 and Article 4.4 and 4.5, it allows for exemptions to postpone or lower environmental objectives if the measures are disproportionately expensive, and a process of determining that and developing the river basin management plans accordingly. So going through this SWOT analysis that we as a group did, looking across all the various countries, there were significant strengths of these economic provisions. It effectively embodies constrained discretion, which is something that Cunliffe rightly calls for and emphasizes, to justify or lower objectives where the measures are disproportionately costly. And that leads to more efficient environmental management. And with Martin Big and others, I did contribute to a report on a book on developments in environmental regulation. And that set out a number of ways in which the Water Framework Directive's provisions improve the economic impacts of environmental regulation. And if you're interested, I can provide you a copy of that. To give you an example of the greater efficiency, in the second River Basin Management Plan, the assessments done by EA practitioners significantly improve water bodies, with 95% at good and 75% at good by 2027, with net present value of 5 billion, and most importantly, saved 9.3 billion of costs for disproportionately costly measures. Now, what we did in developing Waterco and its application in the UK in this EA water appraisal guidance was develop economic assessment tools that non-economist practitioners can readily apply, and actually came up with a nice logo of "I love economics," which none of the economists would ever dare do a logo of. It embodies three river basin planning cycles, which should promote adaptive management and learning. Its focus is on financial cost recovery, which should lead to greater transparency about subsidies and also reduce those subsidies and reduce the trade distortions that they give. Effectively, it's imports of strawberries from Spain, which are using subsidized water at a lower cost and putting our UK farmers at a competitive disadvantage. It did and should lead to improved knowledge of water impacts of trends in pressures. And in 2006, in the agency, we did a report on the business as usual projections of agricultural activities. It was done for us by University of Cambridge and Scottish Agricultural College. Now, we also, looking at experience across European countries, identified a number of weaknesses and limitations. First off, there was very limited in various countries of long-term forecasting of pressures, including in the UK, really. There were high costs of existing directives, which are partly highlighted already. Now, that led to significant delays before the authorities can do the economic analysis of what's called supplementary Water Framework Directive measures. And for some of the Eastern European countries, they're only just starting on what I would call proper Water Framework Directive now. In the Water Framework Directive, especially in this very thin Annex 3, the requirements for economic analysis were unclear. And it's very frustrating that some people just refer back to that Annex 3 rather than looking at the Waterco guidance and its supplementary guidance notes, which do spell out things in much more detail. There is a lack of agreement on methodologies, especially on the question of environmental costs of water use, which is a tricky subject, but is, to my mind, soluble. In practice, there is limited, well, in the directive, there is limited consideration of water resources, allocation, and scarcity. While it was the first directive that did address water resources as well as water quality together, there is still water resources, excessive extraction, low flows are not prime determinants of good ecological status. And the chalk stream restoration strategy recommended technical changes in the definition of sustainable abstraction and sensitivity bands, especially with respect to chalk streams. Most countries suffer from a lack of resources and institutional capacity to do the economic analysis for the Water Framework Directive. That includes in the UK. In 2015, the glorious Liz Truss, DEFRA Secretary of State, then cut the agency's budget by 58%. And as I said, that cut to a third and effectively demolished the agency's river basin management plan team and capability. And the same problems are widespread across Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, and in many countries in Europe, the authorities have outsourced their economic analysis, and that has led and contributed to being treated as just a compliance tick box task and not a value-added tool to improve the efficiency of water management. And I'll come back to that being fundamental. As a result, there's been a little or poor integration of economic analysis into decision-making to improve water management. The final point I'll highlight is this issue of a spatial mismatch in the Water Framework Directive between national, regional, river basin, district level economic analysis and the assessment of good ecological status at water bodies. A lot of the economic analysis in European countries has been done at national level, but there is spatial problems that the Water Framework Directive operates at a river basin district level, which is too big, but the measures and requirements are, and the achievement of good ecological status is at water body level, which are too many, and that has not been addressed. Nor does it address how to prioritize that situation where you've got too many failing water bodies. So looking positive now, we have significant opportunities. Well, you may think increasing costs is not an opportunity, but it is for an economist anyway. There are increasing concerns about costs, and that should lead to the need to address trade-offs and prevent disproportionately costly targets. Unfortunately, in the UK, that hasn't been done over the last few years, where we've gone for siloed targets, which have very high costs and very low benefit cost ratio, less than 0.1 for the storm overflows plan. There is a need to shift from prescriptive siloed, rigid prescriptive targets to strategic and systemic goals. And Cunliffe does recommend going for system assessments at river basin district level. And in his interim report, he was very critical of the silo targets, but that's been watered down in the final report. There is a need for more multi-level and sectoral coordination. There's a need for more prioritization, and there is greater potential for economic and financial and revenue-raising instruments, and I'll come up with some recommendations for that. Finally, there is greater importance of nature-based solutions yielding multiple benefits, and the emergence of ecosystem services approach, which should and can help promote such nature-based solutions. But we face significant threats. We have competing policy pressures and demand to contain bills. In the past, bills have fallen in real terms since water bills, that is, for customers, since 2010, and we have periodic price hikes in 2004 and just recently in 2024 when the declining infrastructure problems become severe and evident. We have constrained institutional capacity for economic analysis, and this is throughout Europe and especially in the UK. And those public finance constraints are binding and will not go away. We have population and housing growth pressures, which lead to water infrastructure shortcomings, and that has and is leading to siloed water policies and also other policies like housing targets, with the problems that they give for the water environment. There is a problem of risk aversion and crisis management that discourages optioneering and innovative alternatives that could yield wider benefits. And that was something that we flagged up in the EU report as being evident across various countries, and Cunliffe rightly flags that up as being the case in the UK. For the agency being risk averse due to resource constraints, budget cuts, and a bureaucratic bias to visible, defensible, low-risk solutions to a specific problem, and where you have prescriptive siloed targets that discriminate against NBS. There are weak feedback loops and incentive for learning that hasn't been applied so far in where we are. So moving forwards to the conclusions and recommendations, first and fundamental one is to reform, not ditch, the Water Framework Directive. And this is the conclusion of 3 major reports and ours as well. The EC Resilience Strategy sets out the Water Framework Directive and River Basin Plans are the key comprehensive regulatory framework, and Cunliffe says the same, as does the OEP. But they also say it needs to be made fit for the future and needs substantial reform with greater transparency and broader scope, which I go along with. And I also go along with their recommendation of replacing the one out, all out by improvements in elements of achieving good status. And finally, the OEP makes the fundamental recommendation or conclusion that the Water Frameworks Directive needs proper implementation. And our report is consistently stresses all those things, and therefore we've set out how to improve the Water Framework Directive. So, starting, first one is a greater emphasis on water resource and water scarcity and enhancing resilience. This is something that the EC's water resilience strategy emphasizes and is a very strong message in our report. The second strong message in the report is to change mindsets. So we need to treat economic analysis as an integral aid to improving decision-making on choices and trade-offs, not a complete procedural tick box compliance exercise. And in the FWR webinar, I got asked, what does that mean and whose mindsets are we looking to change and how? And on reflection, I think it should be done in the following sequence. The first step is to change the mindsets of water policymakers and authorities and decision makers, especially DEFRA and also the European Commission. Then the media and social media, then the practitioners, and get the Environment Agency to get back its mojo. Then academics, technical and consultation experts and economists and stakeholders. All have a part to play, and that will be fundamental. We also need to refine the River Basin Management Plan to be a multi-level strategic systems plans across sectors and across administrative levels. Now, we stress though all those aspects. Cunliffe does go for systems plans, which is good news, but he does it at too high a level to my mind. He does it at River Basin District level, which is one of the problems in the past, and has significant problems with at sub-basin level and the significant chasm between the River Basin District and the catchment hosts who are operating at sub-catchment level. And there needs to be the systems plans need to work much more on hydrological level and also at sub-basin level. So, moving on to refinements for the river basin management plans. First off, we need to prioritize. We need a process that focuses on significant trade-offs for outstanding options in critical hydrological catchments and sub-basins, for which, in line with capacity and financial constraints, the agency and the bodies can provide technical and economic assessments to inform and aid and improve those options. Fundamentally, we need to focus on a long-run goal of a refined good ecological status, which I think all the bodies we're looking at, including Cunliffe, does recommend, and that we should get away from our current prevalence of siloed prescriptive targets. We need to apply cost-benefit analysis, ecosystem services assessments, payments for ecosystem services to cover wider benefits and enhance nature-based solutions and innovative solutions in river basin plans that are aligned with flood risk management plans in effectively integrated water and flood risk management. We need to link water and floods water framework directive with the floods directive, marine strategy directive, the natures directive, climate change concerns, with linked economic assessments that we can do as they're based on cost benefit analysis, which enables links across those various domains. One of the problems I have with Cunliffe is it effectively he ducked this issue of links to the floods issues, and because that was outside his remit, and effectively he's gone back to his what he was tasked to do, and effectively recommends an integrated regulator of the water industry with a necessarily strengthened economic regulator. He hasn't abolished Ofwat, by the way, which looks stronger than the rather downgraded Environment Agency, which looks to be largely a permitting authority. That is fundamentally not integrated water regulation, and it goes against integrated environmental management that we've been trying to do for the last 20 years with considerable success, and that's very frustrating. Moving on, we need to integrate with land use planning and agriculture policies, and I'll give you a specific recommendation on that in a minute. On the bits of economic bits, and the methodologies, we need simple, user-friendly economic assessment tools that can be applied practically by non-economist practitioners who are at the coalface and deal with these trade-offs, and hence need and appreciate help that they can get from useful economic analysis. We need guidance on the economic methods with informal exchange and coherent application across European countries, and certainly in the Waterco process, that was very effective. We need to link with the economic assessments with consultation by providing assessment of costs and benefits in accessible formats for different types of bodies and people, groups and stakeholders. Finally, we need to bring in economics early. It takes time to develop these tools, and we need to start to do it, to develop fit-for-purpose tools early rather than leave it too late, which is what's been happening over the last 10, 20 years or so. The one exception to that was actually the agency and DEFRA's collaborative research program, which led to the NWEB's valuation strategy in 2007, which paved the way to the second River Basin Plan. Now, I was asked at the last webinar, which country would be a good example, and I couldn't come up with it. The best I could come up with was the England and Wales in the River Basin Plan second round. But I think the best answer is actually to look at the specific elements of the refinements and then develop the measures accordingly. Final recommendations regard the Article 9 cost recovery provisions in the Water Framework Directive, and those need to be extended. They need to be extended to finance programs of measures and resource the technical and economic assessment for those processes through cost recovery charges for major polluters. We need to make housing developments pay for their additional costs of supplying water and treating sewerage from the new houses. We need to promote economic instruments and the polluter pays principle regarding nutrients, pesticides, and fertilizer taxes. We need extended producer responsibilities nationally for national product problems of chemicals, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics to pay for their water pollution costs and to reduce these national problems, which need to be handled nationally rather than at River Basin Plan level. Finally, we need to use environmental and resource costs assessments in Article 9 to promote charges, both national and regional, to enhance water saving and resilience. And we need the process audited by an independent body, such as the Office for Environmental Protection. Thank you. Any comments and questions, most welcome.
So, Jonathan, thank you very much for that. I'll just stop